We gain a lot of knowledge from our perception. For example, our first bits of knowledge that we gained as babies is based on perception with a combination of reason. However, our perception is limited by our sense organs. For example, our eyes can only see the certain wavelengths that are within the visible light spectrum, and our ears can only pick up certain frequencies, and with age, that ability to pick up higher frequencies is lost, limiting our perception even further. Again, our noses are also very limited. For example, they bring in dogs to sniff out small amounts of blood at crime scenes because they are not visible to our eyes since they are so small, and our noses aren't that receptive to the smell, and so they bring in dogs. So we've discussed the many ways that our senses are flawed, and thus it makes us wonder what is reality like without these limitations, and what further knowledge could we acquire if these limitations were removed?
The first example of what is really out there is pain, taste, and color. You have probably attempted once in your life to bring your hand close to fire. However, thanks to your senses, you bring your hand away before serious injury occurs because of the experienced pain. Thus, if by accident you burn your hand in fire, you think the resulting pain as being in your hand rather than in the fire. You think the pain is not in the fire, only an independent experience of it. The pain felt is nothing more than a subjective experience that results from your interaction between your hand and fire. To further the idea of pain, we know that physical pain is simply an illusion because the human nervous system is the cause of experiencing pain, which is what stops humans from further damage, just like the example with fire. For example, the brain does not have pain receptors. Therefore, a neurosurgeon can poke your brain and no reaction can be obtained because it is not painful. To counter this, how does a neurosurgeon know how much pain or injury he is causing without indication, even though he is a specialist in his field? Also, the brain interprets pain for the whole body in order to understand pain. Moving forward with taste, an example is that if you drink a can of Coca-Cola, it tastes sweet. But does the sweetness exist in the cola or in your mouth? Taking the information from the previous example, you would agree that sweetness is simply subjective experience that results from the interaction between your taste buds and the cola. Therefore, you are using your sense to interpret the taste. I found an interesting example with taste, that something that I may find delicious may be not appealing to your own taste. This is relative and subjective to your own opinion. Galileo said, "The tickle is not in the feather," meaning that we can only rely on our sense of perception as to what is going on in the real world. The sense of tickle is felt by the human because it creates a pleasant sensation that causes a human to laugh. Therefore, pain and taste are merely subjective experiences. But how about color? When it comes to color, you feel less sure about this way of thinking. For us, it is true that the grass is green, the sky is blue, and the snow is white. If we were to apply this idea to the concept of sweetness and cola, the green is not in the grass, just like sweetness and cola and pain and fire. The green color in the grass is simply an interaction between your eyes and the underlying structure of the grass. If our eyes evolved in a different way and were sensitive to light at a different wavelength, we would not see it at all. We seem to push ourselves to the unsettling conclusion that reality is colorless. To counter this, many studies have actually said that people do see color, only a certain spectrum of it, and many colors have not been discovered by the human eye yet.
So the second example will be to observe the question, if a tree falls in the forest without anyone to hear it, is there any sound? The simple answer to this question is yes, there is sound. We can base this conclusion off of our past experiences of when a heavy object hits the ground. We observe a loud crash or bang sound. However, to fully understand this question, we have to differentiate between the two senses of the word sound. So sound one will represent physical sound, meaning the vibrations from the tree hitting the ground that go through the air. In other words, the sound waves. Sound two will be the experience sound, which is the result of the sound waves from sound one reaching our ear, causing our perception of the tree's fall. So to answer the question using these two differentiations of the word sound, there would be sound one, the vibrations. However, there would be no sound two, as there are no ears to receive those vibrations and perceive them as noise. So another example of this idea would be if a phone were to ring at home when no one is there. In this case, there would be sound one because the phone still gives off vibrations into the air. However, there are no ears to receive these vibrations, so there would be no sound too, and it would ultimately be quiet. Okay, so when we apply this concept to the universe as a whole, this leads us to believe that before human and animal life on Earth, our world was silent. This means that there was sound 1, but no sound 2, as there were no ears to perceive the sound waves. We can hardly imagine how this would be considering how loud certain natural events are. For example, a volcanic eruption, waves crashing, waterfalls, or earthquakes. So hypothetically speaking, if there were no humans or animals left on the Earth, our world would revert back to being silent. We can also apply this concept to color. When you think of a flower that blooms and dies in a garden without anyone to see it, we can then pose the question, did the flower ever have color? When we use the same differentiation as we did for sound, we can conclude that there would be physical color, meaning the chemical makeup of the plant would be the same. However, there would be no experienced color, the color that we perceive as red or purple or pink, since there are no eyes to catch the reflection of light off of the plant. So these examples ultimately lead us to believe that we can't be certain that colors or sounds exist independently of our experience of them.
Our next situation is tables in a classroom. If you left your class, how would you know that the tables aren't moving and that they're still there? Or, a more commonly known situation, the toy story. How can Andy be sure that his toys aren't moving when he goes to school? Well, he could always come home and check on them, but as we know, when he's not looking, the toys are free to move. So, a solution you might think of is videotaping them. However, this solution just relocates the situation. Now, one would wonder, well, do the pictures still stay on the on the computer or the video camera when one isn't looking? And so this demonstrates to us that what we see, or better yet, what we can't see, is limiting what we know. So we could use another WOK of imagination. However, somebody might think you're crazy if you said your toys are moving when you're not looking. Now, you might wonder why a philosopher would even bother asking these odd and useless questions. But they serve the purpose of making us think differently and making us think of what could be out there if we didn't limit ourselves. And they might also serve the purpose of telling us that it's none of our business what inanimate objects do when we're not looking.
Okay, so now moving into theories of reality. There are 3 theories that propose the relationship between our perception of reality and reality itself. The first is called common sense realism. A way to remember this is what you see is what is there, meaning that the way we perceive our world mirrors how the world really is. This theory relies solely on our senses. For example, if someone were to sneeze, I would know that they sneeze because I can see it and I can hear it. This theory can be faulty because our senses can often mislead us. This is because through the process of interpretation, our brains select only part of what we sense to form our interpretation, which may result in a false interpretation. So let's imagine the situation where I'm at a hospital and I see a patient start crying after they receive news from a doctor. So my perception of this situation would lead me to the interpretation that this person has received bad news and that they're sad. However, if I misheard the news that the doctor gave them, and they were in fact crying because they were overjoyed with good news, this would be an example of when my senses gave me a false interpretation of a situation. Another example would be to observe the difference between how a colorblind person views the world and how someone who is not colorblind views the world. The senses of these 2 people would lead them to perceive the world in 2 different ways, resulting in 2 different interpretations of reality. By not concluding to the same ultimate reality, this example poses another counter-argument to the theory of common sense realism.
As you know, theories of reality is the relationship between perception and reality. I will introduce right now scientific realism. This is the view that the real world is not the world as it appears to our senses, but as it is described by science. According to this theory, the world exists as an independent reality, but different from the way we perceive it. A physicist called Sir Arthur Eddington compared the common sense description of a table with a scientific one. According to common sense, a table has extension and color. However, the scientific description says that the table draws attention particularly to the strangeness as a scientific picture of reality. And he says, quote, sparsely scattered in that emptiness are numerous electric charges rushing about with great speed. The comfortable world we live in every day and daily experience vanishes and is replaced by colorless and soundless atoms whizzing in empty space. So we may ask ourselves, what should we believe? With regards to scientific realism, a slogan in the textbook indicates that atoms in the void explains scientific realism. This is simply a view that is quite contradicting in itself, because if an atom is an indivisible unit and a void is empty space, that means it is an empty space containing nothing but atoms. Therefore, the void is defined to be empty and not empty at the same time. To sum up, or put this in simpler words, scientific realism is accepting that although science is not perfect, it has a decent explanation of the world. A pessimistic view would be that if most previous theories are false, then so are the current ones. To counter this, someone may say that we must only consider the mature theories. Going a little bit more in depth with scientific realism, it generally takes three forms or commitments. The first being metaphysically. It focuses on the rejection of idealism, and it says that there's a physical world independent of our mind, and that world is what scientists study, which is incompatible with idealism. This is one metaphysical commitment, since scientists are studying not their thoughts, but something in this world, therefore things that exist. Semantically, this is the statements that someone makes. Scientific realists deny scientific instrumentalism, which is that ideas are useful instruments. They claim that scientific claims are literally true, not just predicting phenomena. Finally, epistemically, scientific realists claim that theories constitute knowledge. This conflicts with skepticism, of course, like undetermination. To conclude, the thought of scientific realists, no matter which commitment this relates to scientific theories which reference the physical world and confer with knowledge, and is at odds with idealism, instrumentalism, and skepticism.
Our next and final theory is the theory of phenomenalism, which is an extreme version of empiricism. Empiricism, in simpler terms, believes that knowledge is based on experiences, and these experiences are initiated by perception. Phenomenalism would state that an object does not exist in itself, but instead exists as senses. For an object to exist, it must have the permanent possibility of sensation. As phenomenalism is difficult to understand, it can be best described by the slogan created by the Irish philosopher George Berkeley, which states, "To be is to be perceived." So, for something to exist, it must be perceived in some way, for example, by sight or by smell. However, it can also have the possibility of being perceived eventually, which allows for it to exist. A phenomenalist would believe that it does not make sense that the world exists independent of our experience of it, since it follows that our knowledge is based on experience. However, it does not mean that the world does not exist beyond our experience of it, because this knowledge claim is limited by our experience. All that can be claimed about the reality independent of our experience is that nothing can be said about it. So this leaves us to believe that we don't have a right to express our opinions about ultimate reality.
Ultimately, the question comes down to what should you believe? You can either stick with empiricism, or you can reject strict empiricism and insist that there's a world that exists independent of our experience of it. An example to support this idea is if you were to leave a fire burning, and when you return, you see a pile of ashes. The only obvious explanation for this is that the fire continued burning while you were gone. Another example would be if you were to put cake batter in the oven and return to a freshly baked cake. Again, we can justify this by claiming that the oven continuously worked while you were gone. This belief that the world exists independent of our experience of it is very common because we can easily find examples to support it in our everyday life.
In conclusion, at the beginning of the chapter, we began stressing the importance of perception. However, an in-depth analysis has shown us that there is more to perception that meets the eye. We cannot take everything for granted because it may deceive us. This chapter has taught us to distinguish between appearance and reality for an accurate picture of the world.